Visual Metaphor by Jake Copperthite. A metaphor is a figure of speech in which a word or phrase literally denoting one kind of idea is used in place of another to suggest a likeness or analogy between them. George Lakoff makes a little more accurate identification of metaphors when he says that metaphors are understandings and experiences of one kind in terms of another. For example, time is money, or life is a journey. This presentation is specifically designed to deal with visual metaphors, something that we have covered in our class, Visual Rhetoric. A visual metaphor is one image or set of images used in place of another to suggest an analogy between the two images or sets of images. In his article, In Pictorial Metaphor in Advertising, Charles Forrestville sets out a theoretical framework for the analysis of pictorial metaphors. A pictorial or visual metaphor occurs when one visual element is compared to another visual element, which belongs to a different category or frame of meaning. A familiar example is the technique of juxtaposing an image of a sports car with the image of a panther, suggesting that the product has comparable qualities of speed, power, and endurance. A variation on this common technique is to merge elements of the car and a wild animal, creating a composite image. We will see an example of this form of composite image, a comparison between a car and a wild animal, a little later in this presentation. To be effective, a visual metaphor has several requirements. The first is that it must use familiar material, that is, material of which the viewer must have had some previous encounter in some context so that they know that they have a basis from which to work on to create the metaphor. The second is that it must not be too complex, and that it also must not be too simple. If the image is too simple, the audience won't understand the metaphor, and it will not make any sense to them. If it is too complex, the viewer will try to overthink the image, and it will become pointless and not clear to the viewer. There must include enough detail so that the learner or the viewer can process the metaphor quickly. If the viewer's ability level is not taken into consideration and too much or too little detail is added, the metaphor will fail. Now that we have an idea of what a visual metaphor is, let's look at and analyze it after we talk about what the role of the observer is. The role of the observer is to observe, interpret, and utilize the image. They observe the image by visually encountering it. They interpret the image by applying the cultural context and connotations of the material presented in the image, and they utilize the image by completing the metaphor, by drawing the connection between the attributes of the two unlike symbols depicted in the metaphor, and extracting the complete definition and the completion of the metaphor that the viewer or that the creator is trying to reach. Now let's look at some images. This first image, the connection established is between an SUV and a rhinoceros. In common culture, a rhino is often referred to as being very tough. There are many types of vehicles on the road, and many of them have a reputation of not being very sturdy or strong. Here the company is making the claim that their SUV is as tough as a rhino. They are connecting the cultural understanding of a rhinoceros to their product through a visual metaphor. More specifically, through a physical juxtaposition of placing a rhino between two wheels and assembling a car's bodywork over top of the rhinoceros, giving the idea that each of their cars contains an individual rhino. This image is making a connection between loud sounds and hearing damage. The man standing in the picture stands for a man. The drill gun on the right is meant to represent sound. However, drill guns don't make that much noise. So to complete this metaphor, the viewer has to understand that the drill gun is drilling into the guy's ear. The drill gun is trying to connect the cultural idea of sounds drilling into your ears. This metaphor is somewhat more complicated than the first metaphor because it relies on a greater breadth of understanding. On this slide, I have two images. The one on the left is connected to the Tour de France race and the controversy surrounding the use of drugs by cyclists in this race. The connection is being made by creating a racing bicycle with a syringe as its main section. This works to comment on how drugs have become an integral part of this infamous race. The second image is of a man in a suit with the head of a snow leopard. Only by using the anchorage in this image can we understand what the metaphor is about. The idea in this image is that a communication arts degree will turn someone into a design animal. The suit is connected to the idea of power, money, and success. The animal is connected to the ideas of primal power, ferocity, instinct, and survival. By putting these two together, the advertising is attempting to create a connection between the power of an education and the power of an animal. This last image is by far my favorite. It is an attempt to create a connection between a camera and a tank. Cameras carry a history of being rather fragile, even though they can take great pictures. Usually the better the picture, the more delicate the camera. Tanks, however, carry a very different connotation. Despite having seen the earlier image of a rhino, if I asked you to name something tough, the most likely choice would be a tank. Tanks have a strong history in the United States, a strong cultural foundation. That is why we have a plethora of verbal metaphors about the toughness and power of tanks. Terms such as built like a tank, strong as a tank, and so on. By putting the camera on top of the tank in place of the normal turret, the advertisement is making the connection between this brand of camera and toughness. Via this advertisement, their camera is as tough as a tank. What do you think of these visual metaphors? Do you think they are successful in transferring some of the attributes of one item to another? Here are the sources where I found my material. Thank you for watching.